With the release of Kirby and the Forgotten Land on Nintendo Switch 2, I have been playing through this masterpiece once more, and I have come to realize that this specific game is indeed better than Donkey Kong Bonanza, which, of course, makes the game better than Super Mario Odyssey, and by extension, makes Kirby and the Forgotten Land the single best platformer, 3D platformer, on Nintendo Switch. Although it's true that this game hasn't sold as well as Mario Odyssey, I think the difference in quality is very palpable if you actually play both. Kirby and the Forgotten Land is just bursting with creativity, with great locations, great gameplay from start to finish. Every single time you turn the game on, you are blown away by just the sheer amount of passion and love put into every frame of this game. In comparison, Odyssey and Bonanza are very superficially complex. They are superficially wide, open, large, ambitious. All of the ideas that Odyssey and Bonanza have don't nearly come together as cohesively. There are lots of times in those games, especially if you're going for 100% completion, where you feel as if they aren't quite as good as they should be, that they aren't perfect, that they aren't as fine-tuned, that they don't hit the same highs. I've long said that the mindset that 3D platformers are superior to 2D platformers because 3D platformers are more technologically advanced was a complete fallacy, but I think that can also extend to open world platformers versus more limited traditional 3D platformers, because I think Donkey Kong Bonanza and Mario Odyssey in a lot of ways have a lot of growing pains. They are more ambitious than traditional 3D platformers. They're way bigger, they have way more content, way more mechanics, way more things going on, but at the same time, what they're doing doesn't necessarily make the game better, even if they are technically more ambitious. In short, just because Kirby is a lesser known video game character and has sold less units than Mario and Donkey Kong, that doesn't necessarily mean the game is lesser. Just because the game isn't as wide open and because there isn't as much content doesn't make the game worse. If anything, I think the fact that the game is so good all the way through with no dips in quality, that it's consistently top tier platforming, top 10 action, top 10 gameplay, amazing boss fights, I think this game is leaps and bounds above its competitors. I think this game is a downright masterpiece, and to this day, we are still going through this strange situation where a lot of people don't want to admit it. And this, I think, is the core problem with the current video game industry, is that everyone's crying about games getting worse, they're getting lower quality, that companies don't care, that they can't produce anything good, original, or exciting, that there's nothing to play, and yet every single time, games like this are completely written off and ignored. Games like Princess Peach Showtime are completely written off and ignored. Games like Mario and Luigi Brothership are completely written off and ignored. And these are some of the best games that have come out in recent memory. Traditionally, gamers have evaluated video games based entirely on how they look. Back in the 90s and 2000s, the default response to new games coming out was, oh, look at those graphics. People were obsessed with how realistic games looked, how many bits there were, the target demographic for it, because it had to be made for young adult men. A lot of very great games, ones that were better than the big AAA ones like Grand Theft Auto, like Halo, like Gears of War, went completely under the radar during the Wii and DS era because the vast majority of the gaming public was not willing to come to terms with the fact that just because something was more realistic or more mature, that didn't necessarily make it better. Over the decades, Mario has become this universally recognized video game brand, and so it isn't universally disregarded the same way. People try and write off these games, they try to ignore them, or they hyperfixate on like downplaying spin-off games that aren't nearly as popular as like the mainline 3D ones. Games like Mario and Luigi Brothership, games like Mario Strikers Battle League, games like Paper Mario the Origami King. It is very difficult to downplay Super Mario Odyssey because it was built off of decades of high quality classic games that a lot of fans have grown up with. So, the traditional method of downplaying the new Nintendo game by comparing it to third party games doesn't necessarily work anymore because Mario, in a lot of sense, commands a lot more respect than virtually anything else in the industry. And so, what has happened is that instead of the traditional downplaying of the major new Nintendo games, what we're seeing instead is a downplaying of the B-list titles. Games like Mario and Luigi Brothership, games like Princess Peach Showtime, and games like Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Games all of which I consider to be far superior to Super Mario Odyssey. So to put it very simply, the reason that Kirby and the Forgotten Land isn't universally considered better than Mario Odyssey is simply because a lot of people who played Mario Odyssey consider it to be their favorite Nintendo game ever because they simply haven't played any other Nintendo games. Mario Odyssey is only the best if you have no experience with Nintendo or its games at all. Super Mario Odyssey is such a big deal for a lot of people that it became obvious to everyone before the game even came out that this was going to be one of the best games ever made, one of the best games on Switch, and one of the best games in the Mario series. But those of us who actually played it and actually think about this kind of thing very quickly realized that that wasn't actually true. And when it came time to kind of address this fact, to bring up the fact that Mario Odyssey didn't necessarily live up to the hype and the attention, the default response we got has always been, just kind of a shrug of the shoulders and just being like, well, this is the one I like though. And there certainly is a sound logic to that because this is video games. These are video games. This is entertainment. This isn't meant to be like some super serious thing. But at the same time, if you're disregarding like the better games that exist in order to prop up Mario Odyssey on a pedestal it doesn't deserve, who's really losing out here, right? How many dozens of games have Nintendo fans missed out on because of the insistence on the community that some games are completely awful or unplayable, How often have we seen over the past generation, people trying to gaslight you into thinking Bayonetta 3 was bad, or No More Heroes 3 was bad, or Pokemon Scarlet and Violet was bad, or that Mario and Luigi Brothership was bad, or that Princess Peach Showtime was bad. It happens all the time. And yet, all of these are really great games with their own dedicated audiences and people that really like them for what they are. So, I say, Mario Odyssey should not be put on a pedestal. Mario Odyssey should not be seen as the gold standard when it comes to Nintendo games. I have known far too many people who have written off better games simply because of this misplaced belief that, well, it's not as good as Mario Odyssey. I've seen this happen over and over and over again. Most recently with